The QInput component is an absolute masterpiece. I love it. I think it's going to absolutely blow your mind. You might have just used this component every now and then, but hopefully in this video, you'll realize the amount of breadth and depth that this component has and how it makes life so much easier for developers like you and me to just get up and running fast and to go deep into creating a beautiful UI for our users. So let's go ahead and dive in because there is so much to share with the QInput component. Let's go ahead and use it. QInput, and we can add a V model here, and let's say input text. I can then come down here and then import, add a view, ref, and then we can come down here and say const input text is equal to a ref, and we'll make that an empty string by default. All right, let's see if that works. There's our input. Not very much for now, but now we can see that it works. And what I might do is show a pre-tag here because I like to always see what I'm working with. Paste that in there. And now we can just check that what we're typing in actually does match up. And I might change this to a column as well, just so they're above each other. There we go. All right, what else can we do? Well, we can add a label as well. My input, save it, and then we get this beautiful label, and when we click it, it floats to the top, so we get that really nice effect by default. We can also say to stack the label. So if I say stack dash label, it means that by default it's going to be stacked, so we don't get that animation anymore. That might be something that you desire. We can also add a placeholder in here. Placeholder, and then maybe this is for entering the user's name. So we could say your name, and then maybe we change the label to name. Save it, and there we go. I think this would look better if we weren't stacking the label, so let's remove this. Now we can click on there, and then it just comes up with a placeholder, which I think is really nice, just for a little bit of extra help for the user. Another thing we can do is say for. Now, for is really interesting. It sets the name of the field for when you're using it inside of a form. It sets the ID of the field, and it sets the for attribute of the label, and it's going to make sure that the for attribute of the label aligns with the ID. I'll show you what I mean. If I type name in there, and then we open up the console, and we'll just click on here. Let's actually maximize this so we can explore it a bit more easily. Let's find that label. There's the label, and we can say for has now been set to name. The input ID has also been set to name. And the name has also been set to name, which means that when we submit it, we're going to have a name field equal to whatever this field is set at the time. So that's really good to know. The for property can be super handy, and I recommend always setting it to something sensical in your application. Usually it's going to be similar to the field in the database for that field on the front end. We also have hint. So we could say your full name, and then we get that nice little hint at the bottom there. And then we can also say hide-hint. Now this one's interesting. It means the hint will be hidden so that everything's simple by default. But then when we click on here, we then get that little hint showing up. So I really like that because now we only have the label, but then when we click on here, we get the placeholder and we get the hint. So if there's a field that's especially difficult to understand, maybe users are entering the wrong data, you can have all of this at your disposal. You can have a hint, you can have a placeholder, and you can have a label to ensure that you're getting the right data. I love it. Another thing we can do is set a max length here, max dash length, and that's just going to enforce a length. So let's set that equal to 3. And now I can only enter 3 characters. Oh, I might have to do a refresh here, or maybe that needs to have a colon at the start. Let's try that. Oh, it looks like I need to get rid of this dash. Maybe that's going to fix it. And there we go. We can only set 3 characters. Okay, let's move on to some of the design stuff. I think you're going to love this. We can also say filled. I might get rid of max length there, and I might get rid of hint. Let's just simplify this a little bit. And that's going to give it a filled background. This is what I usually use for my fields because I feel like it's a little bit easier to see than just having an underline, but it really does depend on the context. Another thing we can use is outlined. Outlined. This is kind of what they use like in a lot of Google contact applications. That's really nice too. We can also have stand out, and it means that when we select this field, it's going to stand out a little bit more. I've never used that, but I kind of like it. Another thing we can do is set borderless, and this is particularly useful inside of a table. So it just removes a lot of the styling, and it means that if this is inside of a table, it fits really beautifully. So for example, you'd probably also get rid of the label here because you'd have a column. You'd probably get rid of the placeholder as well, and then you just have the table cell. And when I click on here, I can type into it. So that's really good to know. If you want to remove all of the styling, borderless might be something that you want to reach for. We can also set dense here. And I might just bring field back in because I really like field. And that's just going to make everything a little bit denser so that it fits into tight places. In fact, back to that part I was talking about with using it in tables, I'll often set dense and then borderless just so it fits really nicely into a cell, often without field. Yeah, that's going to fit really nicely into a table cell. All right, what else can we do? We can also make the edges square. So if we say square here, it's just going to ensure that those edges are squared off if that's the design that you prefer. We can also say rounded, and that's going to round off the edges. And another thing we can do is say loading. So let's set that equal to true. I've spelled that wrong. Loading. And it means we get this spinner. This is really, really handy. Often what I'll do is say, hey, when this is blurred, so at blur, then I want you to do a backend request. And whilst it's doing that backend request, you can have this spinner showing up. And then when the request is done, of course, it will then be set to false. And that makes it disappear. So that's really good to know. We've got loading. Another thing we can do is set a prefix. So let's set the prefix equal to $. And this just lets the user know, hey, you're going to be entering a monetary value there. And another thing you can do is a suffix, which is basically the opposite of prefix. And a good example of that would be a percentage. So then you might say, for example, 100%. And I'll quickly take the opportunity to note that anything that you add onto the input that is not part of Quasar's API is going to be sent to the input component, the raw input component. I'll show you what I mean by that. If we put in, for example, beep, or maybe like foo or bar, save that. Now open up our console and look at the element. You'll notice that we've got beep, foo, bar. That's all being passed directly to the input. So it's not putting it on the outside of the component. So rather than putting it all the way up the component here, it sends it all the way down to the input. So if you want to use any input props, you can literally just throw it directly on this component. It's really, really handy to know that. All right, what else can we do? Of course, we can set the color. Let's use lime there because that's a very underused color. And that means we're going to get these beautiful lime colors in the effect. And that's a little bit more obvious when we say outlined. We can see that it's lime. Another thing we can do is set it to a label color. So if I come in here and say label-color, and maybe we'll set that to a darker lime, like lime 11. And then we want to have a label, so let's say your name. Save it. All right, so that doesn't look very good at all. Let's change this to a 9. Yeah, that's going to make it a bit darker. So that's good to know. You can also change the label color as well. Just be careful doing this kind of thing, because if you don't know what you're doing, changing the label color can make it quite difficult for the user to see. So you might want to check with a designer, or I usually just try and keep things as simple as possible with my design and only use primary, secondary colors, and occasionally accent colors. So if you feel like your apps don't usually look quite right and you don't feel like you're very comfortable with design, just use your primary and secondary colors for the most part, maybe an accent very rarely, and you're going to end up with a design that's almost always going to look at least decent. All right, so good rule to follow. Avoid colors, avoid too many busy colors in your website. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. So let's move on to the next thing. We can also set the background color. So bg-color, and let's set that equal to black. And that's about it for color. So let's move on to some other functionality that we have available to us. Let's remove all of that, bring back in field because I love field. And let's add in disable. So disable basically means that we can't enter any data here. And this is a way of saying, hey, this field is disabled. It cannot have data entered into it. So you could have something there by default. So my value. And a good example of where you'd use disabled is if another field is blocking the user from being able to enter something here. In that case, you might use disable. Now, the other option that we have is read only. Read only is a little bit different to disabled. It's kind of like saying this field is only for you to view. And you'll notice that we can actually select the text in there as well when we have read only. And to me, the real difference between these two is that read only says you can view this data. It's purely for display purposes. And disable is giving a slightly different message of, hey, you can't enter data in here because either you don't have permission or there's something else in the form that's invalid, which is blocking you from entering something here. So that's good to know the differences between those two. Another thing we can do is make it clearable. So if we change that to clearable, now we can enter some text and then we can easily clear it back to null by clicking on that little close button. Of course, we can say clear-icon to change that icon to something like backspace. Make sure I enter that correctly, backspace. So that's just a slightly different label. Another thing that we can do is set a debounce. Debounce, and then 1000, and that basically means that this value isn't going to update unless a value hasn't been entered for the past 1 second. I'll show you what I mean. Enter a value, I'm typing, stop, and then it updates. So the cool thing about this is if you need to make a request to the backend based on this model changing, you can set a debounce of 1000, and that means the user can be typing more stuff, typing it in, and then when they're done, then it sends the request to update it on the backend. So debounces are very, very handy, especially if you don't want to bombard the backend. All right, what else can we do? I mentioned before that we can have a hint, type your full name. Another thing that we can add to the bottom space here is a counter. So we can say counter and set that equal to true. So in fact, I can just add it like so, save it, and it just means that as we type in values, it's going to change the counter as well. Let's get rid of that debouncer now. We don't need it anymore. And as I type, it's going to update that counter value. Now let's move on to input types. And I want to note that this is not Quasar code that I'm about to show you. It's up to the browser how these input types are displayed. So if I come in here and then say type is equal to password, and let's simplify this a little bit more again. So we're back to just field, and that means that it's going to be shown as a password. Another one that we have is date, and this is going to be using Google Chrome's date browser picker. That's going to look different on an Android device or an iOS device. It just means that the browser is going to use its native date picker there. So that's kind of good to know, and it might be something that you decide to use, especially if you want the user to feel comfortable using your forms, because it kind of lines up a little bit more with what their browser is set up with. So it's kind of a trade-off because you lose a bit of control over the design, but it means the user gets to use something that they're used to. Another one that we have here is time. This one looks actually quite nice on my browser. Another one that we have is a number. And this adds these little bars at the right side, at least on Google Chrome. So we can increment it like so. And something worth noting is that this is actually a number here. So if I come in here and I might just add a colon, and then we say type of input text, notice that it's a string, but we want that to be a number. So we can say vmodel.number, and that's going to ensure that this value does in fact end up being a number. So that's a really good thing to know if you're setting the type equal to number, or if you want to model a number there. Let's see if I can type letters in. No, it actually doesn't let me type in letters. So this is particularly useful if you're using numbers. Oh, and one more thing I want to point out, when you're using numbers, make sure when you set the label, for example, my number, make sure you do some testing with how it shows, because if it doesn't stack like that, and it looks like in this case it is actually stacking by default, but if it doesn't stack like it is here, then often that can collide with some of the controls on different devices. So for example, maybe on an Android or on an iOS device, this label is actually going to clash with some of the interface options. So you just want to be aware of that when you're setting the type equal to number. Kind of an edge casey thing that you might not need to worry about, but you might want to test on different devices. Speaking of edge cases, you probably don't want to use file here. So it is an option. If you want, you can just type in the type as file, and you can actually do that and it will work. However, I recommend just using Quasar's QFile component, which is going to be a much nicer file picker experience, or Quasar's QUploader component instead. Another one that we have here is text area, and that uses the text area component, so we can change the size. And we have a really cool option here called auto grow. So when you're using text area, you can just say, hey, auto grow as I type more stuff in. So line 1, if I press enter, it automatically grows the text area. Line 2, line 3, you see what I mean. I think that's really cool that we get that extra flexibility, because I've had to build this in the past and it really is quite frustrating. So auto grow is good to know about. All right, moving on. Next, I want to talk about using QInput inside of a form component. So let's select this, Control-Shift-P, and I'm going to wrap that inside of a QForm component. Now, if I try and submit this, and we're going to need a button as well, Q-button, let's set the label equal to submit, and let's give it a type equal to submit. All right, so we'll type something in there, submit. Now notice that name is equal to, and then the value here. Now the reason name is working there is because we said for and then name. Okay, so what it's basically doing here is it's saying the ID is name, the label is for name, but it's also setting the name on that input equal to name. I know that's a little bit confusing. Let me just change this to something else like email. And let's set the label equal to email. And I'll explain that again. So basically, the name for this input, and I'll show you it here, is going to be equal to email. So it's going to be somewhere in there. There we go. The name is equal to email. And that means when we submit the form, it's going to set email equal to the value. So submit, and there we go. Email is equal to my value. So you can use the for label for that. Or you can use the for label and set the name. So for example, if we set this to your-email, and then we click on this input again, notice that name is now set to your-email. And when we submit this, your-email is now the name of that field. But for the most part, you're probably safe just to use for, because chances are you'll want your ID, the label, and also the input's name to all line up. All right, moving on. Getting rid of QForm there. We'll get rid of this button. Let's bring us back to a really simple example, and I can get rid of this as well. Save it, but we might bring back in field because I love it. So let's take a look at validation. The way Quasar handles validation is, in my opinion, pretty genius. You get an array of functions, and you know what? This is one of those things where I just need to show you. So if we say rules here, and then we pass through an array, I'll show you how it works. We can then say value is equal to, so this is a function, and then if we do not have a value, so in other words, if this is false, we're going to return a string that says field is required. So what it does is it evaluates this, and if it evaluates to true, then the validation is okay. If it evaluates to false, then the string is returned. And when Quasar gets that string, it then uses it as the error, which means we get this really nice syntax for doing rules with Quasar validation. In fact, often you can just do your rules inline and you don't have to bring in any validation libraries or anything like that for 90% of use cases. I really think that it's handled beautifully with Quasar. So let's refresh the page here and set that equal to nothing. And there we go, field is required. It's run that function. That's resulted in false, and therefore the string has been returned and Quasar has displayed the validation rule. Another thing we could do is length. So let's just put a comma here and add another rule, val, and then let's check that the val.length is less than or equal to 3. If we get false there, then the rule is going to show please use maximum 3 characters. Save it, and now we start typing. once we hit too many characters, we get that validation rule showing up. How cool is that? It is so easy to handle validation with Quasar. And then, of course, you could just cut that, and then you could say rules here, and I could just come down here and say const rules is equal to an array, and I could just whack those directly in there. Save it, and I believe that's still going to work. It does. So it's really easy to kind of extract this into its own file if you want to have a file of rules. Actually, let's explore that idea a little bit further. So you could have a function that says is required. I hope this works because I didn't plan this for the video. And that function is basically going to be this. So we'll return that there and receive val. And we'll do the same thing for the length. So max length 3. This probably isn't the best way to do it, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how you might extract this. So for the max lengths, you probably want to send through a value and then maybe return a function. I don't know, I haven't really thought about it, but you can see how this could work. So let's cut that and then return it here. Get rid of that. And I have to add the word function there. And now we can just use these two rules. So let's scroll up. And for the rules, we can give it an array, which is required and max length 3. Let's see if that works. And it does. How cool is that? This is really, really readable, and it works just the same. But as I was saying, you would probably want a function here that returns a function. So you could say like, okay, not there, here. You could say max length, and then just pass through a 3. You know, something like that. Oh, it keeps auto-completing it. But you get the idea. You could then say max length 3, or you could say it's a range between two numbers, and then that would return a function that then uses the value that was passed through. But anyway, I'm beating a dead horse here, so let's move ahead. Change that back to max length 3. We can also say no dash error dash icon. So notice we get this error icon here. If you feel like that's a little bit too much, we can add no error icon, and it means that it's not going to show. So it just means we're not yelling at the user whenever they enter something wrong. I actually like to use no error icon. I think it is a little bit unnecessary a lot of the time, a bit over the top. Another thing we can do is say lazy dash rules, save it, and that means if I type it in, notice that the rules haven't been triggered, and then when I unfocus, then the rules get triggered. Again, I feel like this is a bit kinder to the user. Often when rules come up a little bit too early, the user's thinking, oh, look, I know, especially for something like an email, they might be thinking, look, I know it's an invalid email. I haven't finished typing it in yet. So lazy rules might be a good option for your app. And the last one I want to show you is setting this to on demand. So check this out. If I type that in and then unfocus, the rules don't get triggered. And that's because on demand basically is saying this needs to be manually triggered. If something hasn't triggered this input's validation, I'm not going to run the rules. So now what we can do is Control-Shift-Enter or Control-Shift-P, I might do it that way, Control-Shift-P wrap. And let's wrap that inside of a Q-form. And now I want to say when this form submits, I want you to run validation on the form. So basically, I want to say, wait until the user has submitted the form, then check the validation. All right, so I'll come up here and say at submit, and then we have to say .prevent.stop so it doesn't submit to the page. And we're going to set that equal to a function, which will be on submit. And we'll write that function in a second. Next, I'll say class is equal to Q-gutter-medium, just so we get a little bit nicer UI. And let's come down here and we'll create that function on submit console.log submit form. Okay, just to kind of mimic submitting the form here. Obviously, you do an AJAX request or something like that at this point. Okay, so scrolling up, we'll save the file. And now we need a button for submitting the form. Q-button, we'll set the type equal to submit, and then the label equal to submit. And let's just see where we're at. There we go. Notice that it waits until the form has actually been submitted before showing those errors. Now I'll show you another neat trick here. We can come in here and say ref is equal to email input, and then I can come down here and then say const email input is equal to ref, and we'll make that an empty ref. So basically when this component is run, email input, this ref, is automatically going to be set to the QInput component. And now we can add another button here, Q-button, and set the label equal to reset validation. And what I can do now is easily refer to this input component and reset its validation. At click is equal to email input. So now we've got this component, the email input component, dot reset validation. Let's check if that worked. Submit, we get the error. Reset validation, it removes it. How cool is that? We get some insane flexibility over how we do errors using Quasar's forms. And a quick side story on this, I've actually spoken to the creator of Quasar, and he mentioned that he spent literally years thinking about the API for when he went from Quasar 0.18 to Quasar version 1 to ensure that the API was really, really solid for the future of Quasar so that things didn't have to constantly be changed when we wanted to upgrade the app, and so that we get this beautiful interface with all of these different components. So it's literally years and years in the making, this gorgeous API that we've ended up with. Speaking of which, check this out. Our rule can actually be a promise. So let's add another one in here called username not taken. I'll get rid of these ones, and let's see if we can build a username not taken rule. So let's cross these out, and we'll create an async function, which is username not taken. In fact, this might actually work better as a promise. Yeah, we'll say username.taken, which receives the value. And then imagine we want to hit a backend that basically checks whether or not that username has been taken. So we can say here return a new promise, and that's going to receive resolve and then reject. I won't actually use reject in this example, but you can imagine that you would probably want to set that up. Now we'll say set timeout just to mimic an API request, and we'll set that equal to 1,500, which is 1.5 seconds. Then we will resolve this promise to true. So let's save that and see if I've done that correctly. And in this case, you probably want that rule to be debounce. So let's come up here, and I can get rid of a lot of this now. We'll get rid of on submit. We'll get rid of email input. I just want to do a little bit of cleanup here. Get rid of QForm. So we're back to a simpler example. No error icon. And that'll do. So now let's add in a debounce equal to 1,000 seconds. So now we can say, for example, ldiebold, and I'll wait for a second there, and it looks like everything was okay. So now let's go to username not taken, but this time resolve it to an error. This username has been taken. So if that's resolved to a string, Quasar is going to assume it's an error and that the string is the error message. So let's try this now. ldiebold. Oh, and it looks like this isn't working. There's probably a couple of things I need to fix up. All right, we need to get rid of this on demand. And let's check if it works now. We can actually get rid of .number there as well. And we'll type in something like ldiebold as a username. And there we go. This username has been taken. How cool is that? We didn't even have to add in the loading spinner. That was already handled for us. We just return a promise, make sure that it resolves correctly, and all the rest is handled by Quasar. So if I were to return false here, that would also work. However, we're not going to get a message. So we still get an error, but we don't get a message. So you do want to return either true or a string in this case. Okay. So, I know that's a lot. What I've just shown you is internal validation rules. Now we're going to move on to external, which basically means your backend is going to be handling the errors for you, and all you need to do is display them. So, the first thing we need to do is add bottom slots for that to work. I might just return us to a simpler example. I want to make sure I'm constantly culling stuff so that our example is as simple as possible. There we go. We might even set this to an empty string. Now we want to say bottom dash slots here. And the reason we do that is it gives a little bit of extra space underneath the input just so it's prepared for an error message. And it means that when the error message shows, Quasar is able to do a little bit of an animation that shows that error. If you don't have the bottom slot area available, then it can't smoothly show that animation. That's why we want to add bottom slots here when we're handling errors ourselves. Next, we're going to have error, which will be equal to a Boolean. So let's set that equal to true, and then it puts it into an error state. So you can imagine you'd get a backend response, and then based on that backend response, if there are errors, you would then set this to true if there is an email error. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. We can set an error dash message. So in your response, you would receive an error message, and that would be passed through here. For example, email is required. Save it, and there we go. It's pretty much as simple as that. That's how you do external error. You basically say whether or not the error is showing, and then you supply the message. And it's also good to know that we have this bottom slots that is required as well. Now, one thing I will point out is you can even say now hide dash bottom dash space. And what that means is if there are no errors, so let's set this equal to false, it hides that bottom space. So it's basically saying we are not going to reserve space here, but that also means you won't get that nice animation when the errors show. So where possible, you probably don't want to use hide bottom space, but if you don't really care about the animations and you can't really lay things out nicely because of that bottom space, and you want your inputs a little bit closer together, then you might want to set hide bottom space. That's just a good little thing to know. And actually on that, let me just show you something that I've run into in the past. If you don't test the state of your errors, so let's set that to true, and let's get rid of hide bottom space there. Notice that these are a little bit close together and it doesn't really look very good. So what you might do then is say class is equal to q dash margin bottom small, and that looks a little bit better. Now, often what people will do is they'll set it to something like medium, and that looks good when they're in an error state. But when they're not in an error state, now they look too far apart. So this is one of the reasons that you might want to use hide bottom space. And it's the reason that I've used it in the past. So hide dash bottom dash space means that we get a really nice sort of closer style with our inputs. And when we are in an error state, it then just takes up the space that is needed. So that's a good use case for using hide bottom space if you can't get your layouts to look nice, especially when displaying errors. Okay, last thing I want to show you in relation to errors. Let's get rid of that. And we'll get rid of hide bottom space. We can actually override the error slot. So let's get rid of this. And then we'll come in here and say template. And let's add in there error. And then we can say here the error, save it, refresh the page. And just note that when you use this slot, you're going to have to get rid of the error message because you're basically saying, hey, I'm going to take control of the error message myself. So now we could, for example, select this and then just put it inside of a Q chip. And then maybe you'd set the color of that equal to red. Okay, it looks a bit silly, but you get the idea. You get total control over this error slot. And whilst we're on the topic, let's go ahead and explore slots. Once again, I'll bring us back to a simpler example. And one of the slots that we have available to us is prefix. So I showed you the prefix attribute, but with the prefix slot, it means we can do more. For example, you might want to have an icon, q-icon, and then give it a name equal to something like account. I think that's an icon. Oh, sorry, it's not prefix, it's prepend. There we go. And it looks like account is not an icon. Let's try user or maybe mail. I know that's an icon. There we go. So we can prepend. We can also append. And that's going to throw it to the end. And notice that prepend and append add it inside of the input. If you want it to be outside of the input, you can say before and after. And I often use after in this case and then add a add button, something like add. And instead of an icon there, let's change that to a Q-button. And then how about we make it round? We'll change that to icon and I'll give it a color equal to gray, and then I'll also make it unelevated. There we go, and you can imagine that might show a dialog. I especially like using this in a select menu. So if we're using a select component here, you can say plus, and then that'll give you a dialog where you can then add a new item to the select menu. But anyway, we're talking about the input component. Another one that we have is label. So you have total control over what this label looks like. And we could change that to a Q-chip. And then maybe we can make that dense and then change the text to email, or keep the text as email. And there we go. How cool is that? You get total control over the label. We've got a couple of others for slots, like tapping into the loading spinner and the counter, but we won't cover those because this is going to be a very long video already. So moving on to masks now. We can come in here and say mask, and then basically enforce the way the user has to input data in this field. And for this use case, I might change it from email to data, something like that. There we go. And now we can set the mask equal to something like hash, 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 save it. And that means that it has to be a number, number, number. That's what this hashtag symbol means, number. So if I try and type letters in there, which I'm trying to do right now, it doesn't work, but it allows me to write 3 numbers. So this is a great way to say there must only be up to 3 numbers in this field. Same thing for numeric. We can say SSS. And now if I try and type numbers in, it doesn't work, but it only allows me to have 3 letters. Now, there are other ones that we have in the docs, like handling uppercase and lowercase when you're using a mask, but I'm not going to cover it now because, once again, this video is going to be long. Another thing we can set is fill mask. So if I say here fill-mask, then by default we get those underlines. And if we set it equal to something like a hash symbol, then it's going to change those to hashes. This is really cool. It means that we can just then select all of that and start typing in. There we go. And it's just going to replace our mask as we type. Pretty cool. Now, another thing we can do is unmask the value. So notice if I refresh the page here, as I type this in, we get those hashes showing up, which is kind of weird. It's not really what you would expect. So what we can do is say unmasked dash value. Save it. And now when I start typing in, we don't get those hashes showing up. So that's a cool little trick to know about. We can also tell it to reverse fill the mask. So if we change fill mask equal to 0 and set the mask equal to something like this, number, dot, and then number, number. So for example, dollars and then cents. Notice as I start typing in, it types from the start, which is not what you would expect. In this case, you'd actually want it to start filling in numbers from the end. So in that case, we can come in here and say reverse fill mask, save it, and now let's see what happens. There we go. It fills it in from the back into the front. And in this case, you'd probably have a prefix. You could say prefix is equal to dollars, and then you could say suffix is equal to C for cents. So that's kind of cool. We can make a really nice rich input here for monetary values. Okay, we're almost done. The last thing I want to show you is one of Quasar's events, which is the blur event. And the reason I love this event in particular with the QInput component is that it's really great for updating data on the back end. I'll show you what I mean. Let's get rid of all of this and say at blur is equal to update email. And this is going to be a function. So let's come down here and say function update email, which will accept the value. And for now, we'll just say console.log that value. Open up the console. Whoops, I opened my bookmarks. Type in a value, and then when we blur it, notice that we get the result of that event. So I don't actually want the value being passed through there because I would just use the input text here. Input text.value. So let's try this again. And as soon as I click away, the value is then logged. This is fantastic for updating data on the back end because it means that you can just wait until the user's finished, then send the request. And I often link this up to a loading spinner as well. So let's come in here and say loading is equal to updating, and then I can say here const updating is equal to a ref that is false by default, and then to update the email, we will then say updating.value is equal to true, and then something like this. Set timeout to basically mimic doing a backend request. Let's say 1,500, so 1.5 seconds. And then we'll say updating.value is equal to false. Save it. Then I can type something in. When I click out, we get the spinner. And then when it's done, it disappears. How cool is that? This makes it so easy to create a really nice interface for when you're updating values. And when you tie all of this together, where you've got an update to the back end, and then when you get any errors, you just pass them through as errors into the QInput component. You've got your loading spinner. You're using blur to make sure it's just updating when it needs to update, or maybe you're using a debouncer instead. You can do some really, really amazing stuff with this component with very little code. And we have, on top of that, all of these beautiful stylings that I've shown you in this video. So I really think this component is just perfectly done. The API is gorgeous. I don't think I would change a single thing myself. And sometimes I think we need to take a moment and realize just how lucky we are to have this framework. Honestly, I have never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything that has an API that is this ridiculously consistent, that is this rich and simple to use by default, but as I keep saying in these videos, extensible to the nth degree. I never feel like I'm hitting a brick wall with these components. I always feel like the answer to, can you do such and such with a Quasar component? The answer is always, yes, you can. And it's not that difficult to do. And it's been tackled in a really beautiful way, and you're still going to have clean code. So as you can tell, I'm super excited about this framework, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I really do enjoy making these videos for you, and I can't wait to show you other input components that Quasar has to offer. All right, I'll see you in the next one.